Welcome to our first bi-monthly webinar in the new year. I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year from the WIFIA team. Today we'll be talking about federal requirements. First off, let's just go through some logistics for today's webinar. If you can hear me, that's wonderful. It means you successfully figured out the audio. For those who can't, hopefully you will soon be able to hear me. If you have any questions on this webinar, please don't hesitate to type them into the webinar dashboard. We'll get through as many questions towards the end of the presentation as time allows. If you've somehow stumped us on a question, which is likely, or we couldn't get to it during this webinar, have no fear. We'll get to your answers for any outstanding questions in a follow-up email or an FAQ. Thank you for your time today. My name is Dan-Tam Nguyen. I'm part of the WIFIA engineering team. I will go through a brief introduction to our WIFIA program for those who are relatively new to it. With me here today is Alaina McCurdy, who is also part of our engineering team. She'll dive into one of the main areas of federal requirements that are environmental authorities, and I'll touch on the other non-environmental requirements that are also part of our program. I'll wrap up and we'll spend the remainder of the webinar with a Q&A session. Okay, so let's get started. If you're new to WIFIA, here's a brief timeline of the program. WIFIA was established as a federal financing program for water infrastructure projects in 2014 with the passing of the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. The program receives funding through annual appropriations in the form of a credit subsidy. So what this means is for each $1 million appropriated by Congress, the program can provide approximately $100 million in loans for water infrastructure projects. In 2017, we received our first credit subsidy, which allowed us to select 12 projects to apply for a loan. To date, we've issued approximately $3.6 billion in loans, and more are in the processing queue. The latest appropriation for fiscal year 2020 added approximately $5.5 billion in federal funds available. So we continue to invite interested parties to consider financing with the WIFIA program. So EPA has been developing the program for several years now, and we continue to find ways to improve it. We put together this mission statement to convey our intentions for the program. This mission statement is not simply a slogan. Two of the most important terms in the statement are accelerates investment and supplemental credit assistance. The intent here for our program is clear. The WIFIA program is not intended to be the sole source of finance for projects. We provide up to 49% financing of total eligible project costs. Its purpose is to push projects to completion faster and to provide a cost-effective supplement to other sources of financing, such as private equity, revenue bonds, corporate debt, and SRF loans. The WIFIA program provides financing to a broad range of borrowers and projects. Unless you're an individual, you're likely to be eligible to borrow under the program. Projects can include single or multiple projects or program of projects for drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater type projects, as long as it has a common purpose and similar construction timeframes and can be secured by a common security pledge. It also covers energy efficient projects, drinking water and wastewater facilities, and projects eligible for under the SRF programs are also eligible for the WIFIA program. The program can cover costs directly associated with the project, such as land acquisition, planning and design, obviously construction as well. The total project cost used to size the WIFIA loan can also include capitalized interest and loan closing fees. Again, WIFIA provides up to 49% financing of total eligible project costs. Borrowers who receive a WIFIA loan do have to comply with all federal laws and regulations, what we refer to as the collective federal requirements. If you've worked with the state revolving fund programs, you would likely have seen very similar requirements. These include environmental authorities, economic and miscellaneous authorities, civil rights, non-discrimination, and EEO authorities, American Iron and Steel, well known as AIS, and labor laws and standards, most notably the Davis-Bacon Act. Unfortunately, there's no centralized location with a comprehensive listing of these laws, but a non-exhaustive list does exist, and it can be found under the WIFIA implementing regulations under 40 CFR Part 35, Subpart Q. This slide has just a few examples. It can seem to be a lot, but even as early as during an application review or throughout project construction, our engineering team will work closely with the borrower to ensure these laws and regulations are currently being met and can be met for the entirety of the project. So now I will hand over the mic to Alaina, and she'll explain how we do that for the environmental authorities through our NEPA review process.
Thanks, Dan-Tam. Hi, everyone. My name is Alaina McCurdy, and I lead WIFIA's environmental review process. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of WIFIA's environmental requirements. And I appreciate all the interest we've received on this subject, and hopefully you find it as amusing and interesting as I do. A little bit of a NEPA geek over here. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. It's one of our biggest environmental federal laws that WIFIA complies with. NEPA is a procedural law that requires agencies to evaluate the effects of major federal actions, including funding. In the case of WIFIA, the federal action is the WIFIA loan. So when does NEPA apply in the WIFIA process? NEPA requirements don't apply at the letter of interest stage. Projects do not need to have NEPA completed in order to submit an LOI during the NOFA period. Projects can be at any stage of development. NEPA does apply at the application or project review stage, which is after a prospective borrower is invited to apply to WIFIA. EPA is the lead agency for the NEPA decision related to the WIFIA loan. EPA will not obligate funds for a loan prior to completing NEPA. In other words, EPA must complete our NEPA determination prior to closing the loan. So what types of NEPA determinations are there? After assessing potential environmental impacts, the NEPA process results in one of the following determinations: a categorical exclusion, or CADEX, which is the lowest level of NEPA review, a finding of no significant impacts, or FONSI, which is typically the result of an environmental assessment, and EA is kind of the next level up of review, or a record of decision, which is the result of an environmental impact statement, or EIS. And EIS is the highest, most detailed level of environmental review under NEPA. Like I discussed on the previous slide, every WIFIA project or WIFIA loan must receive either a CADEX, a FONSI, or a ROD documenting EPA's NEPA determination prior to loan obligation. In order to complete EPA's NEPA determination, we suggest that prospective borrowers submit all available environmental documents and findings with the LOI and application. And by available, we mean documentation that the prospective borrower already has or is preparing for another environmental review process or for a permitting process. We do not expect every prospective borrower to have everything completed at the time of submittal, but we encourage submitting all information that does exist. This could include documentation from other environmental reviews, whether that be through a state NEPA-like process like California's CEQA process, or documentation like a CERT prepared for an SRF, documents developed in support of the U.S. Army Corps Clean Water Act Section 404 permit, or even previous NEPA completed by another federal agency. If the project has an environmental impact report, or EIR, an environmental assessment, or an EIS, please include that with the application materials. Include draft and final copies and all appendices and technical reports that are associated with that. We encourage prospective borrowers to submit copies of consultation letters and biological and cultural resource technical reports that may have been completed. Sometimes these documents are produced through other processes like the 404 permitting process or state NEPA-like process. Project maps are also encouraged to be submitted. Maps are extremely useful for the environmental review, show all project components, and illustrate the scope of the project. Prospective borrowers can also use EPA's NEPA Assist tool to gather or present information. EPA's NEPA Assist is a publicly available tool for viewing environmental resources. The link for NEPA Assist is at the bottom of this slide. Another tool available to WIFIA is the WIFIA Programmatic Environmental Assessment, or PEA, which was completed in 2018. This is a great option for WIFIA to capture and streamline additional projects that do not qualify for a CADX. It gives us an intermediate level of review without having to prepare a full-blown EA or EIS, which would require posting on the Federal Register and having a public comment period. The PEA evaluated potential environmental impacts for typical projects eligible for WIFIA credit assistance. It was a nationwide evaluation and discussed potential impacts and mitigation measures that might typically occur during construction and operation. The PEA also developed an environmental questionnaire for evaluating specific project impacts, both for non-SRF borrowers and for WIFIA borrowers that are SRF entities. The environmental questionnaire, which is filled out by the borrower, goes through different resource categories like biological, water resources, socioeconomics, etc., and provides checkboxes to help evaluate the level of impacts. Projects covered by the PEA are covered under the 2018 FONSI. The PEA and FONSI determination were previously published for public comment. Therefore, use of the PEA does not require an additional public comment period or an additional posting to the Federal Register, which results in a streamlined review process and time frame. There we go. So what projects qualify or are covered under the PEA? Projects qualify for the PEA when the project type and impacts are within the scope that was considered within the PEA, and proper supporting documentation has been provided, which includes the environmental questionnaire. A link to the environmental questionnaires are at the bottom of this slide. EPA reviews the environmental questionnaire after it is provided in the application phase, and EPA documents that the project is within the scope of the PEA. If not, a project-specific EA or EIS would be considered. The environmental review and compliance documents are very similar between WIFIA and SRF, like Dan-Tam previously mentioned. So if a borrower is familiar with the SRF environmental review requirements and process, then they should be familiar with a lot of the WIFIA environmental requirements as well. Although the SRF and WIFIA make our own NEPA findings, since we each have a separate federal action, the same supporting materials can be used for both SRF and WIFIA environmental reviews. The SRF and WIFIA environmental reviewers can work together to complete the environmental review. We frequently coordinate with SRFs to complete the environmental review, particularly the consultations required under some of the federal cross-cutting authorities that I'll discuss shortly. The WIFIA review can occur before, after, or concurrently with the SRF environmental review. Next, we're going to go through several of the environmental cross-cutting authorities that are included in the WIFIA environmental review process. I won't have time to go through all of them in detail, but I'll spend some time on the ones that are the biggest and can be the most involved. I wanted to highlight one executive order that is included in our environmental review, although there are several others that I'm not going to cover today. Environmental justice is covered under Executive Order 12898, which ensures that no group of people bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences. To determine whether potential EJ communities of concern are present, EPA looks at mostly low-income and minority demographic data. After evaluating the demographic data, we consider potential impacts to these communities and any disproportionate impacts. One tool for evaluating demographic data that I'd like to highlight is EPA's EJ screen. There's a link to that at the bottom of this slide, along with a link to EPA's EJ guidance document. And I'd refer you to this guidance document for any additional information about our EJ reviews. All right, onward. One of the bigger or more involved federal cross-cutting authorities we deal with in the WIFIA program is the National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA. NHPA requires the protection of historic properties from adverse impacts caused by activities undertaken or funded by federal agencies. Pursuant to 30 CFR section 800.19Y, an undertaking is defined as a project, activity, or program funded in whole or part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency. And the WIFIA action is an undertaking. The fundamental responsibilities of federal agencies are expressed in section 106 of the Act, and it's to take into account the effect of any undertaking on any district, site, building, structure, or object that is included or eligible for inclusion in the National Historic Register National Register of Historic Places prior to approval of the expenditure. This also applies to WIFIA. WIFIA needs to complete section 106 process before obligation of the WIFIA loan. This process generally involves the consultation between EPA and relevant state or tribal historic preservation officers, SHPOs or TIPOs, and other interested parties. After identifying the area of potential effects, or the APE, information should be gathered to identify historic properties, which may require conducting additional studies to identify and evaluate historic properties. Prospective borrowers may have completed some of this evaluation or have completed the Section 106 process with another federal agency, for example, the U.S. Army Corps. And if so, I'd recommend this information be provided in the LOI or application. EPA can build on these existing materials to complete the consultation process and meet our requirements under the Act. If no evaluations have occurred, then EPA then this process will then occur during the application process, and EPA will determine what studies, if any, need to be completed. The Endangered Species Act is another major cross-cutting authority that applies to WIFIA projects. ESA protects threatened and endangered species and their critical habitat, requiring EPA to evaluate the potential project impacts to listed species and critical habitats. The ESA consultation process can include Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and must be completed prior to loan obligation. Again, some prospective borrowers may have already completed some relevant studies to help support EPA's consultation process, which may be in the form of biological resources report or something similar. Documentation from any consultations with Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS that may have already taken place through another lead federal agency can be included in the LOI or application. EPA can build on these existing materials to complete the consultation process and meet our requirements under the Act. If no evaluations have occurred, then EPA will complete this process during the WIFIA application. EPA will determine what studies, if any, need to be completed. Next, I wanted to offer up some tips that can really help in the environmental review process. The first tip is to develop a clear project description that outlines all subcomponents or subprojects within the overall WIFIA project. This might seem obvious, but being able to clearly state what is or isn't included in the WIFIA project is very important. And going back and forth to clarify the project description can take time. In the description include pipe lengths, dimensions, whether something is a rehab, replacement, or an installation of new infrastructure or equipment. I also recommend that detailed location descriptions for all project components be provided. While an overall or general location is great, providing specific locations, if known, for all subcomponents makes it a lot easier to complete the required environmental documentation. Providing clear and detailed maps of all project subcomponents is also really helpful to our review. We use maps for our consultations with SHPO and Fish and Wildlife Service and NEMS. If you have GIS shape files for your project, that's great. Please consider sharing them with us or letting us know that they can be provided. And another thing that really contributes to a smooth review is providing organized documentation. A lot of time can be wasted just trying to find documents within the LOI or application. This is especially important if your project has many subcomponents. We suggest keeping all documents for each sub-project together. Last thing I'll recommend is to provide all existing documentation, including documents developed or submitted to the SRF, appendices that are referred to in the submitted documents, and make sure the document you're providing is complete. Provide technical reports, copies of any consultation letters related to the project, and as I mentioned previously, this could be through the core permitting process or from another federal agency. All right. Last, here are a few frequently asked questions about the environmental review that have come up a lot in talking with prospective borrowers and applicants. First, when does the environmental compliance process take place? The environmental review takes place during the WIFIA application process, parallel to the underwriting and engineering reviews after the application is submitted. The environmental review operates on a parallel track with the other portions of the WIFIA application process. We're frequently asked what needs to occur prior to closing. The NEPA review has to be completed prior to the obligation of funds and cannot be deferred until after closing. And yes, we do NEPA on every WIFIA project. This could be a Cat X, coverage under our PEA, or a separate EA or EIS. NHPA and ESA consultations also have to be completed prior to the obligation of funds. Another question, who is responsible for what? EPA is responsible for completing the NEPA and environmental review. EPA writes our own NEPA determinations and consultation letters. EPA is responsible for the consultation processes as the lead federal agency. If there is another federal agency involved in the action, we can coordinate with that agency to determine who will be the lead, similar to how we coordinate with the SRF. If a project may be covered under the WIFIA PEA, the borrower is responsible for filling out the PEA environmental questionnaire. The borrower is responsible for providing project documentation, and depending on the particulars of the project and the consultation needs, the borrower may be requested to conduct, for example, an archaeological survey or biological survey. The borrower is responsible for answering EPA questions during the environmental review process. Okay, next question. No, the borrower doesn't have to have the environmental review completed in order to come in with an application. We can accommodate projects at any level of review or development. Having more of the documentation complete up front can certainly streamline the environmental review timeframe, but we don't expect borrowers to have completed the environmental analysis. And finally, probably the most popular question we get, and it has a very unsatisfying answer, is how long does the environmental review process take? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the complexity of the project, of the particular resources potentially impacted by that project, and the level of completeness of documentation or evaluation completed to date. For most projects, we are easily able to complete the environmental review within the time it takes to work out the financing with the WIFIA underwriters, legal, and risk teams. In very few cases has the environmental review been the limiting factor or the longest part of the WIFIA process. And we do our best to accommodate and work within the applicant's loan closing goal or time frame. And now I'll turn it back over to Dan-Tam and go through other environmental requirements, and we'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type them in at any time.
Great. Thank you, Alaina. So now we're going to go through other federal requirements, the other half of the federal requirements. So as a federal lender, the WIFIA program does have the responsibility of ensuring federal requirements can be met or are met for the loans we issue. And how do we do this? We do check for requirements at all stages of a project and in varying degrees. So when you submit a letter of intent for your project following a NEPA, minimal checking occurs. As part of the submittal, you are required to certify and acknowledge that you are aware of the federal requirements associated with the WIFIA loan. And as a program, this just ensures us that you are ready to talk about federal requirements when you're selected to apply for a loan. When you apply for a loan, we'll delve into federal requirements together. So the engineering team will work closely with you, the borrower, to conduct these checks based on what the phase of the project is. If a project is early in design, we may review sample contract language that you plan to use for contracts. If construction is already underway for a project, we may review executed contracts. And if there are previously incurred costs that you're coming in with, we will also probably look at the eligibility and allocability of those costs. So similarly, in post-loan closing, we will do periodic oversight, including contract reviews for any executed contracts post-loan closing, other document reviews to check for compliance, and we do go out and visit the sites and the project construction site. I think the key question for most folks here today is, how do I comply with all these federal requirements under the WIFIA program? And I understand the list of federal requirements may seem daunting, but as you've heard during Alaina's walkthrough of the environmental authorities, our program wants to ensure you're set for compliance success. These are just general tips once you know federal funding is a possibility for your project, and it is worth mentioning. Once we kind of go through these, I'll touch on some big non-environmental ones in the following slides. A very important step, I think, in terms of compliance is to be able to communicate requirements to all relevant parties. This starts from the top of the chain, the WIFIA program in this case, all the way to the borrower and its representatives. And in some cases, like for the AIS requirement, to the supplier, distributor, and manufacturer of a product. Communication can take various forms, but the simplest being communicating the requirements through written contracts and agreements with those parties. The WIFIA program has developed a document outlining required and/or suggested contract language for the federal requirements listed in the WIFIA implementing regulations. So that's 40 CFR Part 35 Subpart Q. This WIFIA insert serves as a good starting point of reference for most borrowers. Beginning with the selected borrowers for fiscal year 2019, we have provided this document along with the application materials as standard protocol. I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if you don't know whether you're doing something right for a federal law or regulation, it doesn't hurt to ask for clarification or guidance. I will admit that I have not personally committed to memory the implementing requirements for all of these federal requirements, but I can help you find the information you need to get you started on the right path. Lastly, I think it's very important to show proof of implementation beyond the contracts. So this can also take many forms, and there's no set standard that we require for doing this. Though this doesn't guarantee compliance, I think as long as you can easily locate the information and show what you've done, this can go a long way. And also starting early goes a long way. So let's start with a big one, AIS. This is one of the big two of non-environmental federal requirements for the WIFIA program. And if you've worked with the SRF programs, it's essentially the same requirement. The provisions require the use of primarily iron and steel products to be produced in the US for federally funded projects. So there's a list of products covered by AIS, including pipes, pipe fittings, hydrants, municipal castings, tanks, manhole covers, structural steel, reinforced precast concrete, and a general category of construction materials. Where products are not readily available, there is a process for which you can request a waiver for this requirement for that product. Also, there are a number of national waivers that are immediately available for use. The most useful for borrowers being the de minimis waiver. AIS compliance can be pretty straightforward, but it does involve a lot of communication and documentation. If you're planning to use primarily iron and steel products, and in this case, when I say primarily iron and steel, I mean products that have greater than 50% iron or steel, then you're covered by this requirement. And for those products, you want to make sure that you get product certifications when you're purchasing the product. Or if you're having trouble finding a domestic item, come to us. We work closely with the SRF AIS team to consistently implement the AIS requirement, and we do share resources in this area. So as you can see at the bottom of the slide, the reference link is the SRF AIS page because it has a lot of resources in there, and we use the same information to share with our borrowers. For AIS, the WIFIA program does have the responsibility to monitor compliance for this requirement through site visits and also document reviews. In this way, we act similarly to the state SRFs. Davis-Bacon. That's the second of the big two non-environmental federal requirements. And there are other federal labor laws and standards, but I'll focus on just Davis-Bacon for today, which is specific to public buildings and public works projects. And similar to the SRF, this act requires the minimum payment of locally prevailing wage and fringe benefits to laborers and mechanics, and requires appropriate documentation to be able to show that you are paying the minimum payment. This can get confusing because some states do have their own prevailing wage laws. And if you're in one of those states, just make sure all the reporting requirements are covered for both the state and federal law, and that the prevailing wage that you use for those projects is the higher of the two. For Davis-Bacon, the program does also have the responsibility to monitor compliance for this requirement through site visits and document reviews. So for more information on Davis-Bacon requirements, you can refer to the Department of Labor's resource page, which is at the bottom of this slide. All right, I think we've gotten through two of the big ones. There are a couple of other ones that I wanted to touch on today. Civil rights, non-discrimination, EEO authorities. In general, with these authorities, they're fairly standard requirements and are generally expected, even if the language is not specific in the contracts. I believe the only authority in this category that has specific language in contracts is the Equal Employment Opportunity, which is under the Executive Order 11246. How do you comply with these authorities? WIFIA oversight for these federal requirements is limited to contracts review and maybe some on-site review of signage, as outlined in the implementing regs for these authorities. Prior to loan closing, you would be required to complete a civil rights pre-award compliance form, but I think that's the extent of these authorities in terms of what the WIFIA program would look at. For the economic and miscellaneous authorities, I'll touch on a few that require some effort to ensure compliance. The first one being debarment and suspension. So suspension and debarment actions prevent companies and individuals from participating in government contracts or subcontracts, loans, grants, and other assistance programs. As a federal lender, EPA is responsible for checking debarment and suspension status of borrowers prior to issuing loans, and the borrower then is responsible for checking that prime contractors are not debarred or suspended, and that this responsibility then trickles down to subcontracts as well. Restrictions on lobbying using federal funds. This is generally straightforward as part of the application process, and prior to loan closing, we do ask you to complete a certification regarding lobbying, and we'll provide that form to you at the prior to closing. Lastly, for land acquisition activities that are part of the project, the Uniform Relocation Act may also apply. And so I just wanted you to be aware of that as well. Okay, that wraps it up for our federal requirements presentation. Before we start the Q&A session, I'd like to inform you on some additional outreach, webinars, and resources on our WIFIA program if you're interested in learning more. There is a more in-depth AIS training for those interested in deep diving into the topic. It's occurring on January 23rd. The registration link is provided in the slide. It's ran by the SRF AIS team at headquarters. As I previously mentioned, our program works really closely with the team to ensure consistent implementation of this requirement for SRF programs as well as the WIFIA program. Also, in a couple of months, we'll have another bi-monthly webinar on financing a program of projects. A great opportunity to learn if grouping multiple projects into a single loan request makes sense to you. So I would say go to the links and sign up for these great webinars. Lastly, for any prospective borrowers interested in discussing the project and the WIFIA program, feel free to send a request to our centralized inbox. If you have not interacted with us before, I promise we don't bite. Our team is very quick to respond and we're very approachable. Here's a slide of general resources if you want to know more about our program. How the financing works, potential benefits, how to apply, and all the nitty-gritty. It'll also have the recording of this webinar as well as any past webinars that we've done.
Oh.
Just a brief note on the fiscal year 2020 appropriations. If you are interested in the next round of funding, what is special about this latest appropriation is that it is divided into two parts. Congress appropriated a total of $55 million, $5 million of which is the credit subsidy, which equates to about $500 million in loans, is dedicated to financing SRF programs under the WIFIA program, which was established back in 2019. The remaining subsidy, equating to about $5 billion in loans, is available to all eligible borrowers under the base WIFIA program. We anticipate publishing a notice of funding availability, so the NOFA that I referred to earlier, for both the base program and the WIFIA program sometime in May 2020, which is a bit later than NOFAs issued for previous fiscal years. The timing is necessary due to the additional requirements mandated by the Appropriations Act, which must be completed prior to issuing the NOFA for 2020. So please be patient with us while we work through some of these requirements before issuing the NOFA. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the webinar dashboard, and we'll kind of work through them and answer your questions as they come. I'll give you, a couple minutes, and then I'll give Alaina and I some time to kind of gather ourselves. All right, so it looks like we have some good questions coming in. So we'll kind of work through them. I think the first question, let's see. I'm kind of scrolling through. I'm gonna start with the question, what does NOFA stand for? I think Alaina mentioned it once, I mentioned it, and then at the end I defined it. So NOFA stands for Notice of Funding Availability. What that means is once Congress appropriates money to the WIFIA program, generally soon after, we would issue a Notice of Funding Availability, a NOFA, to kind of indicate how much funding we have available to issue in loans. So that's what it stands for. The next question is, LOI must be submitted after NOFA. Does an LOI need to be submitted after the NOFA? So the NOFA does kind of define what the LOI submission period will look like. And so all that information will be provided as part of the NOFA.
The NOFA is what kicks off the submittal of the LOIs.
Correct. Next question is, please repeat the division of SWIFIA and WIFIA funding availability. Do we want to go back to that slide? There we go. So just kind of backtracked a little bit into the FY 2020 appropriation slide there. So $55 million in credit subsidy, which means $5 million of the credit subsidy or $500 million in loans available for the State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers. And then $50 million in credit subsidy, which equates to about $5 billion in loans, will be available free for grabs for all eligible borrowers. Question, is SWIFIA different from state SRFs? Yes, SWIFIA is part of the WIFIA program. It's just a sub-program of the WIFIA program. And it just allows the SRFs to come in for loans for a grouping of projects. How do I?
You guys have a lot of questions.
We're enjoying reading through everyone's questions. We're trying to best decide how to answer them in a way that's going to make the most sense to get through all of them in the time that we have. So a lot of great questions here. So we'll do our best to get through.
Not a problem.
Get through everybody's.
Yeah.
And yeah, in case you didn't hear that, if there's any question we don't get to or a question that comes up in your mind after the webinar ends, you can always email the WIFIA inbox. Do you want to start at the top?
Yeah, well, I just kind of wanted to follow up one more question about the NOFA. It says, has there been any notable changes in the federal requirements from the 2019 NOFA? I think the federal requirements are pretty consistent across the board. I don't think there has been any changes that we're currently aware of.
And I would probably stay tuned for additional webinars and outreach events once the NOFA is ready to come out in the spring. So a lot of those types of questions, we'll be able to get to those a little closer to when it's released, but we will have additional events then.
Yep. Okay, so we're gonna start from the top now and kind of work our way down. So the question is, who is responsible for performing the environmental review for a project that is co-funded with SRF money as well as WIFIA money?
So I guess the straightforward answer is we both make our own NEPA determinations, but as far as other consultations for NHPA or ESA, it kind of depends on the timing of when our review is taking place versus when their review is taking place. If everything's happening at the same time and we're assuming that the scope of what WIFIA and SRF are funding is the same, which is not always the case, it kind of depends on who's able to take the lead on what, and that takes a little bit of coordination between us and the SRF program. But we've worked with a bunch of different SRFs across the country, and we've had a pretty good working relationship with everyone. And I have to tell you, I love it when the SRF goes first, or they're ahead of us in their review, because then I can use all of that wonderful supporting documentation for my environmental review. So it kind of depends on the timing of when things happen. The next question is, someone asked us to confirm whether EPA prefers to submit the Section 106 memo and the consultation letters to SHPO, but will coordinate with other agencies if needed. If there's no one else involved, if there's no SRF dollars, then yes, that would come from us. If SRF is involved, then we would coordinate on see who would send it. Usually we're able to draft the letter so that it covers both the SRF and the WIFIA action in one letter. So regardless of whether we send it or SRF sends it, it would cover both of us, depending on the timing. So hopefully that answers that question. Where are we at next?
I think you answered this one as well, this Section 106
yes.
memo. Okay. Next question, are the requirements basically the same as all federal grant and award programs? I would say basically they're the same. It kind of covers a similar scope in terms of, you know, the acts that we need to look at and ensure compliance with.
All right, the next question on here is, can unrelated projects be bundled into one loan? And Dan-Tam touched on this a little bit at the beginning with a common purpose, and I'll let you take that.
Yeah, so some of the things you want to think about in terms of bundling projects, and you know, if you're interested in program of projects or grouping of projects, our next bi-monthly webinar can kind of delve a little bit more in detail about that. But I think in general, what you want to think about is whether or not the grouping makes sense. So 3 things you want to look at. You want to look at whether or not the projects have a common purpose. You want to look to see if the project has a similar construction time frame, is it occurring within a similar window. And lastly, whether or not those projects can be secured by a common security pledge. Is it wastewater revenues? Is it, you know, water revenues? Is it wastewater and water revenues? Is it general obligation funds? So those are the types of things you would kind of want to look at when you're evaluating bundling of projects.
All right, the next question is about the interest accrual, depending on when the drawdown is and deferral. And as the environmental person, I usually let the underwriters deal with those questions, but maybe Dan-Tam knows.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'm afraid of, because I also am not a finance person, I'm afraid I might not give you the information that you need accurately, but we can definitely follow up with you and make sure you have this information. If you look at our resources page, I think the information is in there if you want to kind of go there and look. And if you don't get the answer looking at those resources, please feel free to reach out to us and ask the question again, and we'll make sure you get the answer you need.
Let's see, the next question is, can you explain what planning level a project should be at for submitting an LOI and application? So I touched on this a little bit in one of my slides, and WIFIA is a pretty flexible program in terms of when projects can come in to us for a loan. It can be at design, 30%, 90%, basically any stage that you're at, we can find a way to work with you and move forward with you on. Let's see. There's a couple of questions on here about the specifics of the NOFA and the timing of those, but we're going to leave those until the outreach webinars come out for those, and you'll probably be flooded with information on that once it's available. Somebody asked if there are application fees or service fees.
The short answer is yes, and it will depend based on the project and loan that you're coming in with in terms of complexity of the reviews that are required. And then service fees in terms of post-loan closing, generally there are service fees associated with the loan.
We've gotten a question if there are any new content or new requirements. And
in terms of federal requirements, I think they remain unchanged. We're not aware of anything that has changed in terms of federal requirements.
So if you've worked with us before and are familiar with the requirements that we've had in the past, they're the same as they have been. Next question, can a local agency implementing a multi-jurisdictional project in partnership with another local agency, jointly funding them, jointly apply for a WIFIA loan? And can multiple local agencies apply as joint applicants? And I think this is a yes and a explanation, because I know we've had different localities joined together, but I think something Dan-Tam mentioned before about a common revenue pledge may be the kicker there.
Yeah, I think we've seen both. We've seen two separate agencies coming in for loans for projects that are associated with each other or linked together. So we would have to kind of take a look at those more closely. In terms of coming together as one single borrower, that is also possible. And if that's something of interest to your agency, please reach out to us and we can kind of, work through the logistics and figure out the details of how you plan to, make it work. And we can kind of give you a little bit more direct insight into how it will work for the WIFIA program.
Someone is asking, what happens if a project runs afoul of federal requirements and cannot remedy? Would the loan amount dispersed be immediately due?
I think that's loan dependent, and it depends on how the loan agreement is set up. And generally, if something does happen in terms of compliance, we'll come up with a remedial action plan to address the issue and can kind of walk through the steps that you need to take to either come back into compliance or figure out, how to deal with the potential non-compliance issue.
And if there was something, I'm not sure if the person who asked this has a particular thing in mind, but if there was something upfront that the borrower or EPA knew about that, was of concern, we would probably try to target that in advance to avoid that circumstance.
And I think, the intent there is not to try to, default a loan or have a borrower default on a loan. So, we'll definitely kind of work through what the issues are and figure out a solution or a remedy for that scenario.
Okay. The next question we received is about AIS waivers. I'm gonna let you take that one.
Okay, so the question is, when could AIS waiver be reviewed for specific products? After LOI and as part of a loan application negotiation, or only after loan contracts are executed? That's a good question. I would say start the work as soon as you identify a potential need for a waiver. There are a couple different steps that can be taken to pre-waiver request that can occur at any point. If it's a general question and you kind of want help in terms of finding a specific product, I think we do have the resources through our SRF AIS team where they can help identify any domestic products, or if not, can kind of give some feedback in terms of how to proceed with the waiver process. If you have any questions on that, that's definitely a question that you can send us. If it's specific to a project or product, you can definitely send it to us. We'll coordinate with our SRF AIS team to get you the information you need and additional feedback that you need to move forward.
Let's see, the next question is about guidelines for whether a borrower should seek funding from only SRF or do a combination of the two sources. But I really, again, not being the financing person, I think that is probably, there are probably better people to answer that than me.
Yeah, I mean, I
It all
think,
depends on your.
yeah, I think you just kind of have to crunch the numbers for your own agency or your own entity to see whether or not it makes sense. I believe one of the webinars we did late last fall kind of touches on this topic. So feel free to go to our WIFIA webpage, go to our resources page. There are several webinars in there, and I believe the last one prior to this one might be helpful to you.
And I would just add that some borrowers might be trying to seek getting full funding from an SRF, but they might be oversubscribed and end up having to also utilize WIFIA funding as well because they're not able to get the full amount.
Yeah, and WIFIA is a supplemental funding source, so it's not always going to be a WIFIA or alternative. It could be WIFIA and a combination of WIFIA and a number of other funding sources. So the next question is, does 2 CFR 200 uniform guidance apply to WIFIA loans? The answer is no. It's the WIFIA loan program is a loan program. It doesn't involve any grants. So, so the UG does not apply.
All right, the next question is about the appropriation for WIFIA. That I think you may have already addressed this, and again, I'll promise that there will be more information out about this.
Yeah, the question is, does the $5 million in appropriations for WIFIA mean that only $500 million in loans can go to SRFs? The answer is no. I think the $5 million in appropriations is dedicated to the WIFIA program, but the remaining $500 million or the $5 billion available in federal funding is available to all entities, including SRF programs.
Let's see, there's a question. Has EPA created a checklist or table of all the federal compliance requirements indicating who the requirement applies to? Yes, you're right. This list is daunting. There are a lot, and sometimes I think we feel like it's a long list as well.
Yeah, and I think, I kind of mentioned in my part of the presentation that we do have what we call the WIFIA federal requirements language insert. And what it really is a source for you guys to be able to look through the different types of regulations that we would typically look for in a project. In terms of applicability and need for compliance. And we would kind of go through those and see how it applies to the borrower or to the contract. But, it does just have language that you would typically see in contracts for either the borrower or their contractors. This is available for the borrowers that have come in fiscal year 2019 that we've selected. And if you are interested in getting a sneak peek at the WIFIA insert, feel free to email our WIFIA inbox and we'll get you a copy of it. It's not something that we kind of keep close to heart. We do want to share that information with you. So if you're interested, please reach out to us.
And I've switched it back to the slide so you all can see the WIFIA email address again in case you have forgotten it. One of the next questions is about NEPA, and it says, if NEPA has not been started, do you suggest waiting until the next NEPA announcement or start earlier? I guess that would really depend. That's a project-specific question, I would think, and whether or not there's a state process, whether or not you think the project might qualify for the CADX. So if that may be something that if you're interested in talking with us about a particular project or set of circumstances, to reach out, and we're happy to chat with you. Let's see, and then the next one is, are there certain people that are best contacts to follow up with questions? So again, I'd probably point you to the main WIFIA box, and if it's a environmental compliance or the other federal requirements, it would kind of be directed to either one of us. But I cannot remember if our contact information is on one of the slides. If it isn't, I would suggest using the main WIFIA email box for that.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Our centralized inbox is kind of our, screening, the folks that man the main WIFIA inbox can get the information or get the questions that you have to the people that can answer them. And that would be the best way for you to reach out to us if you have any specific federal requirements questions.
See, the next question is also about NEPA. What if a project already has a NEPA determination, for example, a reclamation grant funding? Does EPA still need to do its own NEPA determination? Are you able to leverage the existing NEPA documentation for your reviews? So the first part of the question, does EPA still need to do its own review for the WIFIA loan? Yes. So every WIFIA loan will have its own NEPA determination. But for the second part of your question, we can leverage all of those existing documentations. I would expect that we wouldn't need much additional documentation beyond what you've prepared for that previous NEPA determination. But we would write it up separately for specific to the WIFIA loan. Let's see, next question. If there's a bundle of multiple projects, does the NEPA action need to be for the full bundle, or can NEPA proceed for individual projects? This is a good question, and I think some of the underwriters have asked me this question before. Since the NEPA action here is the WIFIA loan, we're only issuing one WIFIA loan. So all the projects covered under that WIFIA loan would be included in that NEPA determination. Next, there's a question, is there a webinar that explains in the most basic terms the WIFIA programs? Yes. Keep your eyes open for probably a whole slew of
WIFIA 101.
Yeah, WIFIA 101 type webinars around when the NOFA is expected. And we do have previous webinars recorded and a lot of really good outreach materials if you're interested in that. See, we're almost down to the end of questions here. Thanks to everybody who's stuck with us so far. Will funding need to be reported on using single audit in order to receive said funding? That seems like not an environmental question to me.
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. And if you can send us this question through the WIFIA inbox, we can follow up and make sure that we are answering the question accurately for you.
All right, let's see. Oh, this one's a good one too. Are WIFIA staff located only in DC or also in the EPA regional offices? So for whatever reason, when they wrote up the statute, it was specifically stated that it would be implemented out of EPA headquarters, which is a bit different than a lot of the other EPA programs where they are partially implemented through the EPA regional offices. So, but yes, there are only, there are only EPA staff that do WIFIA based out of headquarters and not in the regional offices. Depending on the project, we may do some coordination with them, but all the WIFIA staff are here at headquarters. And I think that may be the last question that we've received. So if you've forgotten anything else or want to ask additional questions, you have that WIFIA at epa.gov. And thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you've learned something. And again, if you have any other questions, please reach out to us.
Yeah, so I just put up our Contact Us page. Our website, if you want to go there, there's tons of resources there to learn a little bit more about the program. We'll continue to push out webinars so that you can learn about the program, learn about different aspects of the program, to kind of get a feel for what makes sense to you in terms of a funding source. Our email, our general inbox email is on the slide here, wifia@epa.gov. If you have any questions after this webinar, if you're interested in learning more or you're an interested prospective borrower and want to talk more about your project, feel free to reach us at that inbox as well, and we'll try to set up an appointment to meet up with anyone that you want us to meet with to talk about the project, and we'll kind of explain some of the specifics of the project that might apply to you. And also, if you are interested in receiving announcements about the program, go to that URL there, the tinyurl.com at WIFIA News. If you sign up there, then you'll get all the emails that you want to get about the WIFIA program that we send out. That includes when the NOFA is issued, if we have any upcoming webinars, or any any changes in our program. All of that, all the news about our program will be pushed out through this announcements page. So it doesn't look like there are any other additional questions popping up. So we'll end this webinar early. Thank you, everyone. Hope, again, thank you for your time. We're excited to kick off another exciting year of the program, and we hope to work with you in the near future.